I'd like to welcome everybody to the Parrot Club's April 2024 meeting on the bats of Connecticut. We'll be introducing tonight Dr. Devaughn Fraser, lead mammal biologist for DEEP, that's Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And Dr. Fraser received her doctorate in biology from UCLA, where she used advanced genetic techniques to evaluate impacts of infrastructure development and environmental toxicants on wildlife. Prior to joining DEEP, she worked at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to identify the genetic basis of resistance to white nose syndrome in bats, in addition to landscape genetic studies of several other bat species. She first started working with bats as a field technician in 2009 and has been dedicated to their conservation ever since. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Fraser to take over.
Thank you, Amy, for the introduction. Yeah, I got hooked right away. I was a field tech for many different projects on many different cool species, but then once I met the bats, I was hooked. So, okay, bear with me while I try and share my screen. Oh, of course, and had this down pat. Now I'm trying to find it. Sorry, everyone.
Would you like us to hold questions until the end, or do you want me to periodically read any questions that come up in chat?
Yeah, I'm pretty easygoing, so I'm happy to take questions as they come, if that's more useful for everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Certainly. Okay, I'm going to see if I'm going to go with that one. Share. Can you guys see my presentation? Yeah, good. Okay, great. All right, so thank you everybody who is attending this evening to learn about bats. I know you're all bird lovers, and birds are obviously amazing, and bats are just kind of their nocturnal counterpart in terms of controlling insects and doing the things that flying critters do. So as Amy already said, I'm Devaughn Fraser. I'm the lead mammal biologist for the Wildlife Diversity Program at Connecticut DEEP, which just basically means that I'm in charge of all of the mammals that don't have their own program, like the fur bearers and the New England cottontail. But since the majority of our state-listed mammal species are bats, that takes up pretty much the bulk of my job and my duties. We do a couple other things, small mammal surveys. I just recently detected the least shrew and confirmed its presence, which is our other state endangered mammal. So they're still in the state, which is good news, but we're here to talk about bats. So let's see if my presentation will work. No, it doesn't want to advance, of course. Click. There we go. Okay, so whenever I talk about bats, I always start with setting up a framework for thinking about biodiversity, because I think obviously we're all here and we all care about the natural environment and all the various species that share the planet with us, and we're all concerned about their well-being, as bless our hearts as humans, but we do pose a lot of challenges for wildlife. So having a good way of thinking about biodiversity and getting a really good functional definition, I think, is important for anybody that's interested in all of the other species that we share the planet with. And I think bats are really a great example of this model, which I'll get into in just a moment. So when we think about biodiversity, I think there's, it's in the name itself. It's biological diversity. It's the diversity of life on the planet. And that's a good working definition. But if we break it down into kind of a few different pieces and parts, we start to see that there's interactions that become important. So it's not just compositional diversity, which is how many species are there and how abundant or rare are they, right? Who's there and how many are there? That's kind of the compositional. And I think that's really what most of us think about when we think of biodiversity, is just how many species are there. But there's more to the story. And so you can also think about structural diversity. And this is really, how are the species arranged on the landscape, right? So you could have, as these pictures show, you can have a vast landscape that's just monocultured and just a big, huge, Christmas tree farm. That's going to have very different biodiversity properties than, let's say, a landscape that's been managed for diversity. So different structural heights of the trees, just a lot of structural diversity in the canopy, et cetera. And then the third component, this is really what knits these together. And this is how the structural and the compositional components of biodiversity interact, but specifically they interact in order to sustain biodiversity. So this is all of the amazing things that birds do in terms of pollination that bats also do. This is insect control. This is just key. How do the species that are arranged on the landscape interact in order to make sure that biodiversity continues to thrive and grow? And so the reason bats fit into this so well is because, well, first of all, they're incredibly diverse. There are many, many bat species. And in fact, we're at about 1,400 now species that have been assigned as individual species. And so if you look at the composition of all of the mammals on the planet, which is about 6,000 or so species, bats really make up about 20% of all mammals on the planet. They're the second most diverse group of mammals, next to rodents. Rodents have them beat, but rodents kind of have the advantage of these really fast reproductive lifestyles, and they have a lot of babies, and so it makes sense that they would kind of thrive and diversify a lot quicker. But bats really, once they took to the air and could fly, they opened up and radiated into so many different species and just such a great diversity. And then, of course, because they can fly, they actually have access to places that other mammals couldn't get to or colonize naturally. So in a lot of island systems across the globe, bats are the only truly native mammal species to that island. Now, that's all changed since humans came along, and cats and rats and all the things are everywhere now. But prior to that, the Hawaiian hoary bat, which I have pictured here, is the only native mammal to the Hawaiian Islands, which is pretty fantastic. So bats really do, in terms of just compositional diversity, they're way up there, and they occur everywhere across the globe except for the extreme Arctic and Antarctic regions where it's just too cold to sustain any sort of insect life, and therefore bats. So, but then it's not just the compositional diversity, right? It's also the dietary diversity, which makes them functionally really important in environments. So bats are eating all sorts of things. Most of all of our bats here in Connecticut are insectivores, and so we treasure and value them for the role that they play in controlling like insect pests and agricultural pests and mosquitoes and all the things that kind of irritate us. Bats are helping us out with that. But in other places in the world, they're eating fruit, which means they're really important for seed dispersal and keeping forests alive and thriving and that kind of diversity going, as well as their nectivory, so they're pollinating just like bird species as well. Sanguivores means animals that drink blood. There's only 3 species out of the 1,400 that do this, and 2 of those specialize on birds, and only one of them, the common vampire bat, which is pictured down there in the lower left, actually specialize on mammals. But for the most part, they're going after cattle and not humans. Anyway, you can just see from this, like the different shapes and appearances and all the different things they're eating. Bats play this really important functional role in sustaining biodiversity. So I would be remiss if I didn't take a pause to just dispel some common myths about bats, because as a bat biologist, we are constantly fighting this narrative that all bats are rabid. And in reality, from the best science that we've been able to compile, less than 1% of bats that are flying out on the landscape are actively infected with the virus. So they're not disease-ridden animals. They're actually very clean. They groom a lot. They do have this amazing relationship with viruses because of their unique biology. I won't go too much into that, but with COVID, we all know that bats keep popping back into the media coverage based on this relationship with disease. And what we think that has to do with is their ability to fly, and the metabolic cost of that has actually made them evolve this really interesting strategy where they kind of turn down their antiviral response so that viruses are allowed to replicate, but at low levels, so that they're not ramping up the inflammatory response that also comes along with that. And inflammatory response can be really challenging for the body, right? It costs a lot of energy because bats are flying, and flying is very energetically expensive. The theory is that those things just had to kind of come into balance. So bats can actually tolerate low levels of viruses without getting sick, which is great for the bats. But then when humans come into contact with bats or are encroaching on their environment or making the bats more stressed, such that their immune systems are kind of out of whack, this is where these zoonotic spillovers can happen. So I went on a little bit of a tangent there. Sorry. Figure we all think about bats when we think about viruses, and it's important to know that they're not out there just spreading diseases, that it's an interaction between humans that we need to take responsibility for too. I believe. It's my opinion. But anyway, bats are not blind. They see actually quite well. And if you look at the fruit bat up there at the top picture, you can see how big its eyes are. Their vision is really quite remarkable for this species because they depend on their vision to identify and seek out food. But then the insectivores who are flying at night and chasing down little bitty teeny little insects in the complete darkness, where they're hibernating in these underground environments where there's no sunlight, they have to navigate using a different sense. So they use their ears and they use echolocation, and they're able to do that incredibly well. But they're not blind. They can still see. And in fact, even these little teeny guys with these little teeny eyes, their vision's probably about on par with ours, or maybe even slightly better at night than human vision is at night. So they're not blind. I can guarantee from personal experience that no bat is actually intentionally trying to get tangled in your hair, and it's actually a very rare occurrence. Now, are there people who have had a bat hit them in the head at some point in history? Yes, of course. But bats are certainly, if they're swooping down around your head, it's probably because they're about to save you from a mosquito or some other annoying little insect that was going to buzz in your ear. They're doing you a favor. They're not trying to get caught in your hair. And in fact, that would be a really unfortunate thing for them too. And they have no incentive to do that. So when bats kind of seem like they're dive bombing you, it has nothing to do with you. So don't worry. And then my favorite myth, as an evolutionary biologist or somebody who studied evolution quite closely, bats are not rats with wings. I get that all the time. People are like, "Oh, what do you do?" And I'm like, "I study bats." And they're like, "Ugh, rats with wings." And I'm like, no, hold on. Let's talk about that. Because actually, if you look at the evolutionary history and relationships amongst mammals, I apologize for this is a bit of a complicated figure, but this was the most recent kind of using DNA and molecular genetics to look at the evolutionary history and relationships amongst all mammals on the planet. Bats actually cluster with this large group called Laurasiotheria. That includes so many things: carnivores, things like hedgehogs and pangolins and cervids like deer and whales. So it's just this really big kind of, we haven't resolved it really well, but we know that they cluster with those. And then just above that, if you look at the branch on the tree just above that, you can see that primates, which is us, are basically cousins, essentially evolutionary cousins to rodents. So instead of bats being rats with wings, I like to say that we're actually just really smart bipedal squirrels. Ba-doom, boom, ching. So bats are not rats with wings. They're also just super cool. I like to also call them rebels of the night, because basically bats break all the rules of being small mammals. Most small mammals, they live fast, breed fast, die young. So short lifespans, lots of reproductive output. Bats don't do that. They live really long times. So I think the longest record that we have of a wild bat that was banded at some point and then recaptured some number of years later, some 40 years later. So these little teeny animals can live up to 30, 40 years in the wild, which is almost unheard of for mammals for their size. They're also very slow to reproduce. So typically, especially for the species that we have here, you're talking one pup, almost exclusively one pup per year per female, as opposed to having multiple litters and each litter having 5 kits or pups. They have 1 pup per year. Some species do have twins, and even some species might have up to 3 or 4 babies. But for the most part, it's a very low reproductive number. And then, of course, they're the only mammals that are capable of true flight, which makes them utterly awesome and appreciated by many of us here. So, okay, so I've told you about how awesome bats are so far. I've alluded to it, but let's focus on why should we care about bats. Yes, bats are awesome. They are important to healthy ecosystems, and they provide a lot of free ecosystem services that would otherwise cost us maybe billions of dollars to compensate for in the absence of bats. So there was a paper that was released, I don't know, maybe 12 years ago at this point, where they looked at this and they tried to model and project this economic value of bats to agriculture just in North America. And their estimate ranged somewhere from the low billions every year to maybe 20 billion every year. So those are costs that, would be incurred by farmers and agricultural producers to produce their crops. And usually those costs get passed on to consumers. So those of us who are dealing with inflation right now and dealing with just the crazy cost of living just to feed yourself these days, bats are actually helping kind of offset that cost as well as they can. But the main reason that we really need to focus on this is because in spite of all of these services and the value that they provide for us, they're in a lot of trouble right now. So last year, just around this time, about a year ago, there was a report released by the North American Bat Conservation Alliance, and this is basically government agencies, both federal, state, as well as researchers, academic partners, and some private partners all got together that care about bats and really explored and took a deep dive into what is the population status of all of the species that occur in North America. And what the major finding was actually fairly alarming, that nearly 50%, so nearly half of the bats, the species of bats, which is about 150 that occur across North America, so that includes Mexico, are in risk of a severe decline in the next 15 years. And then you remember I just told you that bats can live up to 30, 40 years. So 15 years is like one bat's lifetime. So to have an entire population decline rapidly in that amount of time for such a long-lived species is really quite alarming and a little discouraging. But the other side of the report was to really emphasize, bats are beneficial. Their extinction risk is rising due to a myriad of threats, which include not only white nose syndrome, but also habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, climate change, potentially a very big one that might influence how well our bats survive. Wind farm development. There's just so many things on the landscape that bats are challenged with. So it's definitely a challenge, but that challenge of stemming the tide of those declines really relies on us, right? Humans are going to have to step up and help these animals survive. So let's zoom down a little bit and focus on Connecticut, because that's what we're here to talk about in our Connecticut bat species. We have technically and officially, there are 9 species of bats that occur here. But the Indiana bat, just Myotis sedalis, they have, we only have one record in the state historically, a single record. And it was almost even potentially a questionable record because it was in a hibernacula. And when they're covered in dew and they're sleeping and you don't really want to mess with them, you can't totally, they're not the easiest to tell apart. So that's a questionable assignment or detection in the state, but they are in neighboring states. And this was actually the first species of bat in North America that was put on the federal endangered species list. And prior to white nose, their declines were caused by habitat loss. Once they were put on the Federal Endangered Species Act, they started to increase and they were doing okay, and then white nose came. So they're back to being very limited and very rare, and especially so. So I don't really think of them as being in Connecticut, but I could be wrong. Maybe we just haven't encountered them, but we don't know that they're here very much. But that leaves us 8 other wonderful and glorious species. And we kind of divide these species into 2 groups. We call our bats that hibernate and go underground every year. These are cave bats because, as the name implies, they're going into caves and using these underground environments to hibernate and survive the limited resources in the winter. And then we have our tree bats, which are conventionally thought of as migratory. So they're not spending the winter here. They typically, or at least historically, were kind of moving down south to warmer climates or potentially places where they could either still forage or go into bouts of torpor, but not be as affected by like sub-zero temperatures. With climate change, there's some interesting responses of different species, and we're actually seeing that they're sticking around in Connecticut throughout the winter. So the future remains to be seen how that all goes. But essentially, we have 9 species. I think of it more as being 8 species that we know are here. 2 of these are now on the endangered species list. So the Indiana bat I already discussed, and then solely due to white nose syndrome, which we'll talk about in a moment, the northern long-eared bat has just recently been added as a federally endangered species. So there's a lot of protections and a lot of work going on to implement protections for these bats in forestry operations and just basically everything that we do. And then the tricolored bat is also proposed for federal listing, and this is also due to white nose syndrome. So it's very rare for a disease to be able to cause extinction of a host because it doesn't do well for that pathogen or whatever's causing the disease to get rid of all of its hosts. Otherwise, and then it goes extinct as well. But fungi are a little different. So white nose is caused by a fungal pathogen, and fungi can just be very, they can have a really broad host range. And unfortunately, if you have hosts that you can switch to, it doesn't really affect you as a pathogen if you get rid of one host, because you have other hosts that you can go to. So that's part of the reason it's so problematic and so challenging to manage for the disease. But let's go to some cute mug shots, because, well, their faces speak for themselves. But these are our 6 species of cave bats that we have in the state. Most of you probably, if you've seen bats out and flying around or have them in your attic at the moment, it's most likely the big brown bat, which is personally one of my favorite species. They don't get a lot of love because they're fairly common, and people tend to have like less of a fondness for common things. But these are wonderful. This is a wonderful species. They're very feisty. Their scientific name is Aptesicus fuscus, and these are the animals that I was tracking for my graduate work when I was a grad student. And they are just feisty and powerful, and you get them in hand and they're fighting and they're boxing with you, but they're feisty and they're lovely, and they have this beautiful glossy fur. So big brown bats, I love them. And then our other species all fall, except for the tricolored bat, fall into a group of a genus called Myotis. So I often refer to these as Myotis species or Myotids. So if I use that throughout the presentation, that's what that means. It's referring to the eastern small-footed, the little brown, northern long-eared, and the Indiana bat. And then we have the tricolored bat as well. So I mentioned big brown bats being common. Currently, they are our most common species. But with white nose syndrome, we still experienced about a 30% decline of this species. So in of itself, if there was one species that was suddenly just, you lost 30% of the population, we would all be up in arms and panicked and trying to figure out what's going on. But then if you look at some of the other species that are more affected by white nose syndrome, we're talking upwards of 90%, 95%, even 100% loss of certain colonies. What were once our most common species on the landscape have all but disappeared. And that especially is true for the northern long-eared bat. And that's why it's on the endangered species list. So, you know, we say, oh, big brown bats are doing fine, but they still declined by 30%. It's just that relative to the 90, maybe 100% of other species, they're still doing okay. And they do seem to be recovering somewhat relative to the other species, but they're still lower in number than they were in a pre-white nose world. And then the tricolored bat has also seen over a 50% decline in where we're finding them. So where they were once spread across the landscape, they're actually spread about half. They're in about half as many places as they used to be. So all of these are very alarming numbers. Here's our migratory tree bats. So these lovely species, all really beautiful as well. Eastern red bat is our second most common species. So this might be, if you haven't seen a big brown bat, but you've seen another bat that's kind of, these guys are often seen foraging kind of in the daytime or the late afternoon. So it's not too surprising when you see these guys out. And they're very stark. They're like red. They're reddish orange, and they have these fabulous black wings. So you can almost really tell when a red bat's flying around. And then our other two species, the hoary bat and the silver-haired bat, these guys are quite a bit more rare than the eastern red. We don't know a lot about these bats. They're solitary. They don't form the huge maternity colonies that some of the Myotis and the big browns form. So we really don't have as good of an understanding of their biology and their seasonal movements. This is an active area of research, especially because they are migratory. These guys tend to be hammered a little harder by things like wind farm development. So a lot of the bat carcasses that we discover, much like birds, bats are getting hammered by wind farms, unfortunately, because we want cleaner energy, but we'd like to not kill all the animals on the landscape while we're getting there. A lot of active research trying to figure out how to curtail these mortalities, but because these species are migratory, they tend to be the ones that are discovered around the base of wind turbines, although other species that I've mentioned that are white nose affected are also affected by turbines as well. So they're kind of getting hit from a lot of different angles, right? All right, so why are cave bats in trouble? Most of you probably know what white nose syndrome is, but I'm just going to go into a little bit of background and kind of update on the status of white nose syndrome in the country. So white nose syndrome it's a fungal disease. It's caused by a fungal pathogen. It affects at least 12 different cave hibernating bat species in North America. And as the pathogen and the disease spread westward across the continent, that number is going to increase because there's different species in the West. What we do believe is that this fungus was introduced accidentally from somewhere in Europe or Asia. Once it arrived on the scene in North America, researchers around the globe started kind of looking out and seeing if they could find signs or evidence of this pathogen or this disease being in other species in other places. And sure enough, it is. It's quite widespread in Europe and Asia. But the bats there, theoretically, or the operating the most reasonable hypothesis is that the bats there have co-evolved alongside this fungus. So they have immunological memory against it. They're not as affected by the actual disease. They'll get the fungus, it'll kind of appear on their nose and their wings, but it doesn't form the really invasive lesions on the wings and the necrosis and the damage to the tissue that it's causing on our bats here in North America. And that's just very likely because our bats were never exposed to it before. It's a new pathogen. So much like we all went through, COVID-19, when we don't have any immunological experience with a pathogen, it can wreak havoc. So that's what's happening with our bats here. What the fungus does is it disrupts their normal hibernation behavior. So it's really just causing them to wake up too frequently in the winter. And every time a bat wakes up, they lower their temperatures, their body temperatures, to match the environment around them so that they can save energy because there's no food around. But then every time they wake up, it's actually really costs a lot of calories. It's like heavy calorie burning just to raise your temperature. That's the majority of the energy usage during the winter, is to wake up and come back to normal temperatures, which they do naturally to drink, to get hydrated, or maybe to groom themselves, maybe to activate a little bit of an immune response throughout the winter. But essentially, prior to white nose, they would do that and then they would just go back to sleep, and they would only do that once every 2 weeks to a month or so. Once white nose showed up, they were just waking up very frequently, once a week, several times a week, and this just caused them to burn through their fat reserves, and so they die of starvation before the end of the winter. So what does this mean for Connecticut bats? The disease was first documented in Connecticut bats in 2008. It was first documented kind of in North America, in our neighboring state in upstate New York, in 2006, 2007. So it didn't take very long for it to get to Connecticut. And we saw steep declines within 2 years of it arriving in 2008. So formerly common species, our most common species prior used to be the little brown bat, and surprisingly the northern long-eared bat. These species are super rare on the landscape now and could still face extinction. Some species do appear to be stabilizing, although albeit at very low numbers. So their mortality isn't as high. They're not dying in the winter quite as at such high levels as they were when white nose first arrived, which suggests that they might be adapting to it or evolving some level of resistance or changing their behaviors so that they're not encountering the fungus. We're still trying to get a handle on what this response looks like. But even so, even in the absence of mortality due to white nose, because bats do reproduce so slowly and are so long-lived, even if you removed all the threat today, it would still take, in the most perfect conditions, decades, if not a century or more, for these animals, these populations, to reach their pre-white nose levels. So, and we're not operating in the best of conditions. We're operating in a space where pesticides are common on the landscape, where climate change is disrupting normal seasonal patterns that bats rely on or have adapted to survive with. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, but don't lose hope. I don't want to make everybody, don't get depressed, everybody. We still have hope. But yeah, like I said, it could take potentially decades, if not longer, for the bats to recover. And so I apologize. Let me focus on the slides for a moment instead of just rambling to everybody. If you look at the graphs that I have here, what that shows, and kind of ignore the dates on the bottom because I messed up and it all looks like the surveys were done on January 1st of every year, but they weren't. But the years are right. So starting in 1988, when we started doing hibernacula or winter surveys at Mine Hill Preserve, which is one of our historically larger hibernacula in the state, right before white nose hit, we were looking at about 2,500 little brown bats. and upwards of 500 tricolored bats and northern long-eared bats. And then you look in 2008, which is the red vertical line down the middle, 2008, that's when white nose first showed up, and you can just see those numbers dropped to virtually zero. And so fast forward to the bottom graph, if we look at 2010, which was 2 years after white nose arrived, we've lost northern long-eareds completely. There's a few little browns left, namely 4, and 3 tricolored bats left, down from 2,500 and 500, and 0 northern long-eareds. So northern long-eareds have completely disappeared from this site. And 2018, fast forward to 2018 and 2023, they still haven't recovered. We still don't have northerns at the site. Big browns seem to be coming into the site a little bit more, and we're up to 7 little brown bats, down from 2,500. So that's how stark this is. And like I said, we are seeing some positive signs of recovery for little browns. Their summer colonies, the 2 colonies that we know of and have been tracking for some time, are slowly increasing over time, but slowly. So this is not the most updated map because I think they just published one like literally this week, or maybe it's coming up next week. But this is the state of white nose now. So basically, the different colors going from cooler colors, the blues, up to the reds, is going forward in time. So that red X indicates where white nose first was detected in upstate New York, and then the spread is kind of visualized by those colors. So as you go from the blues into the greens, into the yellows, oranges, and reds, that's over time how it spreads. You can see it's already, I'm from California, so heartbroken to see that it's there. It's filled in Colorado. We're seeing it in New Mexico. We're seeing it in Texas. Now, the interesting thing about the Western, as it moves west, first of all, there's different species in the West, so we don't know how they're going to respond. There's also very different environmental conditions. So maybe the pathogen won't do as well in those environments, or maybe the winters are warm enough to facilitate some level of foraging in the winter. So bats might survive better. We also know very little. There's not the giant conspicuous hibernacula that we have here. So we don't have places where tens of thousands of bats are all hibernating together in the West, or at least not that we know of. So there's a lot to learn in the West. Unfortunately, the West knowledge of bat biology is very much far behind the Northeast. So we have a lot to learn about our bats just in general there, but especially in terms of white nose. Now, the advantage that the West has is that they have had 15 years to prepare for this. So a lot of the baseline data that we didn't collect because we didn't think about it here in the Northeast, we were just kind of, bats are there and we know they're there. We weren't studying them as intensively. So some of the baseline data that we didn't get in time before white nose came, the West has at least had some time to prepare for that. So we can at least maybe better understand how it's affecting them. But it's spreading, and it's spreading fast, and it's not stopping. Let me, before I didn't really fill in, I didn't include a slide with a lot of the options and the kind of the approaches that we're taking to try and battle white nose as a community of bat biologists in North America and the white nose response team. But there are some promising options for treatment. So some of these are environmental, meaning we're treating the natural environment where the bats are hibernating with things that aren't going to have too much of an impact on the other microbial species in the cave and won't impact the bats negatively, but limits the growth of the fungus. These are all still very preliminary, and it's hard to see how we can scale them up to be effective, but there's promising research. So UV light treatment. This fungus is adapted to soils, and it's adapted to dark cave environments, so they don't do well in sunlight. So that's one option that we're looking at in terms of treating the environment. And then there's a few other options that I won't go into too much detail on. But the challenge is making sure that whatever treatments we enact or implement don't make things worse for other species. We don't want to disrupt natural cave environments. So we have to tread carefully moving forward. There's also some really interesting developments in terms of a vaccine or some probiotic oral treatments that can be put on the bats and limit the growth of the fungus on the actual bats. There's also a lot of logistical challenges with this. Vaccinating bats when they're hibernating, it's easier to maybe catch them and treat them because they're not moving, but also their immune systems are shut down. So they're not going to develop that immune memory against it when their immune systems aren't even operating. So we have to kind of treat them before they go into hibernation. But then, so there's a lot of really amazing, brilliant people working on this problem. I assure you all that everybody is taking it very seriously, but we can't afford to get it wrong, is essentially. So we can't move forward too hastily without knowing what kind of downstream impacts any sort of treatments might have. So they're in the works. There's some promise, but we haven't reached it yet. So we haven't solved the problem yet.
Devaughn, can I
Yeah.
just ask, has white nose hit the massive bat colony at Bracken Cave in Texas?
So Texas is a really interesting site. One thing about, so the Bracken Cave is those are free-tailed bats. They have been shown to be able to carry the fungus, but so far we haven't seen mortalities, anything alarming with that species. So whether they're susceptible or not still kind of remains to be determined. But so far we haven't seen mass mortalities in that species. So that's good news. But that species is also known to migrate in the winter. They're called Brazilian free-tailed bats because a lot of them take off and head south for the winter anyway. And that Bracken Cave is more of a maternity or a summer site for that species. So it might be environmental, it might be ecological or species specific. They might completely not be susceptible to it. We don't really have answers to that yet, but no, the free-tailed bats have not declined at Bracken Cave yet.
I guess that leads to the next question then. Is white nose in Mexico, Central America, South America yet?
Not that we've seen, but certainly the community of bat biologists in Mexico are vigilant, and they're keeping a good view on it. The thing about PD, that's the fungus. It's called a Pseudogymnoascus destructans. So we shorten that to PD. PD is a cold-loving fungus, so it thrives in cold, dark, damp environments. And so the hope, maybe, potentially, is that the tropical spaces that bats are using, subterranean environments in the tropics, are just too warm. But again, these are things that remain to be seen. So, but there's certainly active surveillance going on to see if it shows up in Mexico and more south of that. Good question. Hopefully not. Hope. Okay, so bat conservation in Connecticut, what are we doing? We know, I've just mentioned that these are kind of like overall strategies that the entire community of bat biologists are looking into. The vaccines aren't really relevant to us because our bats have had 15 years to be exposed to this. They're no longer immunologically naive. And so a vaccine probably isn't much of an option. So our strategy really is to continue to monitor. We have a unique opportunity to understand in this kind of natural experiment of this disease how that recovery will look, which species will evolve resistance. Some species just might not have the genetic background to develop resistance, or maybe they do, but just not as quickly as other species that have more of that genetic, that genetic information that could make them resistant. So we do a lot of population monitoring here. This includes counting colonies, maternity colonies. Most of our maternity colonies that we know of at this point are big brown bats. We have 2 substantial little brown bat colonies that we've been monitoring. And the good news is that they've been making progressive increases year to year since I've been here, and I've only been here for 3 years, but I've got 3 years of data showing increases in those colony sizes. So even if our winter colonies are not coming back quite as quickly, that could be because bats just don't like our hibernacula as much. They're not as optimal for their survival, but they're still coming back into Connecticut to spend their summers. So again, I sound like I don't know anything about bats because that's just it. They're hard to study and we're just trying to figure this out. But as well as we can, we follow their maternities, colonies. We do underground winter surveys, which again, if we just looked at those, we would still be very discouraged, but our maternity colony counts are looking a little better. I'll be doing some radio telemetry tracking this summer. So actually putting some radio transmitters onto bats and trying to figure out where they're going and where they're roosting so we can identify more of those colonies. We know there's more of them on the landscape. We just don't know where they are. And then I do a lot of acoustic work. So that's become a really powerful tool and a really non-invasive tool to just kind of passively listen and record all the bat sounds that we hear. And then we can take that back and look at those calls and actually identify them down to species, or at least as close as we can get, and figure out, which species are occurring where, what their habitat preferences are. I'll go into that a little bit more in a moment. Habitat protection is really important. So during the wintertime, bats are very vulnerable in these underground environments. And unfortunately, caves are super fun to go into, and humans love to go into caves, which, is great and it is fun. And in a pre-white nose world, I wouldn't have problems with it. But now in a post-white nose world where bats are already super stressed and vulnerable in the winter, and any level of disturbance can lead to their mortality, we really need to prevent people or limit access to these environments in the winter. So in Connecticut, we have put gates, bat-friendly bat gates over all of our hibernacula that are accessible to the public. And a lot of people don't like us for that, but what can you do? We also put up a lot of bat houses. This is a great way to encourage, well, you can try. Sometimes they don't always colonize, as Amy's had experience with. But putting up the resources for them and saving the habitat for them for when their numbers do come back is a really important step. And the longer these things are on the landscape, the longer the bats have time to discover them. So even if your bat house isn't getting colonized right away, the hope is that the populations will recover over time, and that they'll need places to go and raise their babies. So putting up bat houses, don't get discouraged if they don't get colonized right away. Just know that you're providing an option for bats, and they need as many options as they can get right now. And then another thing that we do is technical assistance. So I provide a lot of technical assistance to the public. If people have bats in their houses and they don't know what to do, I try and talk them through that and let them know what their options are. I try to encourage tolerance. So living with bats isn't the worst possible thing that could happen. And in fact, you can derive a lot of benefits from it. That's not to say that I don't understand when people don't want bats living in their house. But the bats are here. And for the most part, most people go decades without realizing that there's bats in their house. And then they get one bat in their house, and then they find the colony, and then they want them gone. So we do a lot of that. And then obviously I like to give a lot of talks and just public outreach in this regard. So, and then I work really closely with a lot of our land trusts and municipalities for any of their bat concerns. Okay, so just to go into acoustic monitoring, because it is just such a really cool technology and a really cool tool, I thought I'd give you guys a little bit of background on that. So I like to AKA spying on sky puppies, because we're literally just eavesdropping on them, recording their calls as they vocalize, because they're relying on echolocation. So while they're out foraging on the landscape and capturing insects in the dark, they're vocalizing almost constantly while they're flying. And if we can intercept that and record those calls, then we can go back, and we have these fancy softwares that were developed by people far smarter than I will ever be, that we're able to kind of automatically classify, trained on bat calls, that we know what those calls are. And then the computer learns, okay, that's what a tricolored bat looks like. And then you can batch through thousands and thousands of files, and the computer will be like, that's a tricolored bat. That's a tricolored bat. So that's how we do it. And you can see from these quick little screen grabs here why this is effective, is because each species kind of has their own unique trait or call characteristics that can be identified by the computer and by us as well. So up here at the top, up here at the top is the northern long-eared bat. They have this very straight, up and down, very little slope, or very little change in slope across the call. And if you contrast that with the bottom picture, which is the little brown bat, now these are both Myotis species. One is Myotis lucificus, one is Myotis septentrionalis. All the myotids, they have very similar call shapes. So sometimes the computer can't tell them apart, and oftentimes we can't tell them apart enough to assign them down to species. But we'll put them into kind of what we call a phonic group, and just say that this is a myotis, but we don't know which type it is. So that's one of the limitations of this, is it's not perfect, and it really depends on the quality of the calls that you're recording. We've been setting up one of my major projects that I'm trying to get, well, it's underway, but to complete, is to get these permanent bat acoustic monitoring stations out across the state. So this one is down at Barn Island Wildlife Management Area. If anybody ever goes down there, you can check it out. It's right kind of just off the boat launch, just off the trail that's near the boat launch. It's solar paneled, so it's it's active year round. And so I'm able to figure out, especially as you know, our climate and our winter climate is shifting. It's really important to know and try and figure out how bats are responding to that. Are they sticking around on the landscape or are they still migrating? And we have evidence to suggest that some of our tree bats that used to migrate aren't migrating so much anymore. So this is a really good tool that we can use to kind of evaluate those things. Okay, so we have kind of two approaches that we do. What I just discussed was a stationary acoustic monitoring survey. We can also do mobile surveys. So this is almost entirely a volunteer-driven, literally driven project because our volunteers volunteer, gosh, they do 11 surveys per year between May and October. So that's basically 2 surveys a month for 5 or 6 months, which is a lot of time. So we're very grateful to our volunteers. But you put a microphone that's mounted up on top of the vehicle with a magnet, and you drive a predetermined route at about 20 miles per hour. And you do this, you know, starting a half an hour after sunset, and you just go to the end of the route and record all the bats. And there's a GPS operating, so every single bat call has a spatial coordinate assigned to it, and then we can look exactly along this route where different bats are showing up. Now, the difference between these two types of technologies is pretty important, or not technologies. Technology is the same. Approaches, so stationary versus mobile. One is giving you what species are present and in what relative numbers or activity level, not numbers, activity level. So if you have a stationary microphone, you can have 20 bat calls that you picked up on that microphone, but you don't know if that's 20 bats passing by once or 1 bat passing by 20 times. So it's different information. But with the mobile surveys, the theory is that we're driving just a little bit faster than the bats are flying. So theoretically, every bat you pass, you're getting out of its call range quicker. And so that one bat represents that one call, excuse me, represents 1 bat. So they're telling us different things, but both are incredibly important for us to understand what's going on with our bat populations. This is just some quick summary slides or summary figures of these acoustic surveys. So when I got here 3 years ago, I basically went back and took all of the data from 2011 to 2021, and I'm still continuing to, I'm always perpetually behind on processing acoustic data, but I've gotten 21 up and into NABAT, which is this kind of continental-wide monitoring initiative that developed in response to white nose syndrome. So as a whole community, we all put our data into one single place, so we can really look at the status and trends across broader spatial landscapes. So it's really a great tool and a great community of practice there. But this is within Connecticut, and this is from 2011 to 2021. And so what you can see is what I've already kind of alluded to, that big brown bats are the majority of our bats on the landscape now, making up about 75% of calls that we pick up during these mobile surveys. And then eastern reds are about 20%. And then the last 10% or so is split across the remaining 6 species, right? So pretty alarming. Now, a couple of these are tree bats, so they're not rare because of white nose syndrome. They've just always kind of been more rare on the landscape, like the hoary bat and the silver-haired bat. But you can see the close-up or the kind of zoom-in bubble here. Gosh, sorry. Where it shows this 2% and 0%, that the blue, that 2% of calls is all the Myotis species lumped together, because like I said, they could be hard to tell apart. So I just grouped them all together. So that's actually 3 species making up 2% of all of the bat calls that we pick up. And then tricolored bats are somewhere at like 0.3%. So it looks like 0. We do still have tricolored bats, but they are quite rare. But what you can also see from the graphs on the graphs on the right is that there's spatial variation in where bats are abundant and rare. So if we just looked globally across all 12 of these routes that we do, we would think that, you know, big browns are super common and everything else is less than 1 or 2% of the bats. But actually, if you look at the graphs on the right, you can see that, you know, in places like the GWCH, that's our Greenwich route. So these are bougie bats. They like the good life and they love it down there. There's a lot of bats down in Greenwich and Kent, all beautiful parts of the state, a little bit more complex topography, I guess, especially up by Kent, a New Fairfield area. Another possible explanation for this observation is that I mentioned before that bats might be consolidating into the best possible available hibernacula. And those aren't in Connecticut. Those are like in New York and Pennsylvania and not in Connecticut. So it might be that as the bats are kind of repopulating, they've all consolidated and are going further to hibernate. But as they're coming back, maybe they're just kind of filling up in the western part of the state more quickly. We don't know the answer to that. I'm just throwing, these are just, you know, thoughts by Devaughn in the middle of the night, what's going on with our bats. So, but there is spatial variation, and there are some hot spots of activity where our rarer species seem to be doing fairly well. Just another point to make at this spatial variation. So I mentioned Greenwich being the super myotis-rich route, and you can see that here. So that top line is the big brown bats across the statewide. So statewide, they're the most common, and at local levels, they are the most common. But then on the statewide, which is on the left, the second line, the yellowish line, those are our eastern red bats. And they, I said, are our second most common species and make up about 20%, 20 to 25% of our calls. So if you look at Greenwich in particular, that blue line right there that's just below the eastern red bat line, which is yellow, sorry for the confusion. But the myotis are actually doing pretty well and you know, making up somewhere between 10 and 20% of the calls there. So this is really important because as we try and figure out what we need to do and what habitats are important to bats, these type of data is what we can go into and delve into and look really closely at where the bats are common versus where they're not, and determine what types of habitats, what those microhabitat characteristics or those local scale habitat characteristics that the bats are really using. So this is ongoing work. I don't have any results to report here, but this is, I'm still just, like I said, trying to get the data consolidated and ready to be analyzed. It's a massive data set. But these are the types of questions that we can ask using these data. So it's a very valuable, very cool tool that I wish we had used more powerfully prior to white nose arriving, because then we'd have more information to compare it to and really understand how bats are recovering. But we don't have any acoustic data that precedes white nose syndrome. So still kind of a guessing game. How am I doing on time? I ramble a lot. Oh, I'm really late. I'm sorry. I will try and go quickly. So this slide is just really to say that bats are doing different things and eating different things, and that their actual physical appearance and the way that they vocalize is kind of tailored to what they're eating and where they're finding their food. So bats that are foraging in really cluttered environments, like in the forest canopy, are going to have really high-pitched voices because they've got to deal with a lot of background noise, and they need that, the frequency of their call needs to really be able to capture small little things that are in a cluttered environment. So really high frequency bats tend to be foraging in cluttered environments. And then we have our more open space foragers. So like the hoary bat, they like to forage in big agricultural open spaces. So it's important to just realize that depending on where you're sampling for bats, you can have some expectation of where you're going to find them and why they might be more rare or more abundant in certain areas. And this is just their biology, their ecology, and their shape and size has been adapted to what they're eating and where they're finding that food. And so what this means is that in order to really do the best job that we can to create a healthy, full, complete bat assemblage is to focus on a landscape perspective. So creating more of a mosaic of different species and different successional stages, more structural complexity to the forest and the landscape is going to promote higher bat diversity. So, you know, this has been a struggle for our foresters because oftentimes they're out there cutting trees in order to create these mosaics. But a lot of times the public sees that as just cutting trees and nothing else. But just bear in mind that oftentimes when our state foresters are out there and doing this work, they're doing it with a long-term goal of creating that structural complexity in the environment so that they can maximize biodiversity. They're not just cutting down trees to cut down trees. So that's definitely something that we struggle with a lot in terms of our communication with the public, because a lot of people just see that and it aesthetically it looks terrible right after you've cut down trees, but in 10 years that's going to be gorgeous. So it's, you know, we got to think about things on a long-term scale. Another complication with bats is that they have these different seasons of their life. So in the summertime, they're in one place doing one thing, raising their babies together. But then they have to migrate in the spring and fall. So we have to think about the connectivity of the landscape as they're making those movements from where they're going to go spend the winter and then where they're going to spend the summer. And then in the winter, they're all moving to one consolidated location and going underground. So in terms of just like looking at the landscape and trying to optimally manage for bats, it would be a lot easier if they would just stay in one place, but they don't. So that's another reason bat conservation is just really kind of a challenge, is they're moving all over the landscape. And so they have a lot of needs, and those needs are dynamic and change across the season and are also tied to things like climate. So as we have these really mild winters, where bats might have more foraging or might think that they have more foraging opportunities and are sort of waking up and going out to look for insects, but maybe the insects haven't responded quite as quickly. So that's one thing that might make climate change worse for bats that are hibernating. On the contrary, if warmer temperatures in the winter do mean that there are insects active, then maybe bats will have more foraging opportunities and be better able to survive white nose syndrome infections. So these are questions we don't know yet. We're all kind of like, gearing down and bracing for the worst, preparing for the worst, but we can be hopeful that maybe, climate change is overall terrible or not the greatest, but maybe in this case, it might give our bats a little bit of an edge that they need. We just really don't know yet. So here again, just connecting the basic needs of bats. These are the things that keep me up at night, right? They need roosting, they need water, they need foraging, and they need this in multiple different places and different times of the year. So I'm sorry, I just didn't realize how much time I had gone into. Okay, so the important part, what can you guys do for bats? Because we're all in this together, right? Bats need humans, and it's just me working on bats, so I can't do it by myself. And I know you all love animals and bats, so one thing that we can all do is provide habitat. So I already talked about installing bat houses. Again, this can be really discouraging for some people if they don't get colonized right away. But if you build it, they might come. Give them a chance, right? So this is the site of one of our biggest maternity colonies of little brown bats. This is Ruth Cutler. She is awesome. She has basically designated her whole barn just for the bats. And so in addition to these bat houses that the bats use in the summertime, the whole upstairs part of the barn is just Bat City. And she's just given the barn to the bats. So it's really great. This is a very thriving, healthy colony that's growing year after year. And then one of the reasons we think that it's very effective is that she's also very adamant about, or not adamant, but she's good about planting native species. And so anything that you're doing to support pollinators, because pollinators are getting hammered too, is going to be beneficial for bats. And then you have beautiful bumblebees visiting you in the daytime, and then you have bats foraging in the nighttime. So planting those native species, I'm probably preaching to the choir. I'm sure you guys all are on board with the importance of native species versus non-native species where possible. But planting just a really abundant garden that supports a lot of insects is going to support bats and birds as well. So win-win. This is exciting. You guys can, if you want, or if you don't have to help us count them, but you can at least log in and watch them. We just put up a bat cam at the Green Barn at White Memorial Conservation Center. So there's live stream from April until November of a big brown bat maternity colony in this barn. They're not super active right now. So if you log in the daytime, you might not see them. But if you log in, right around sunset, you're going to see the bats flying around. So I'm going to show you a video in just a second. But this serves a lot of really important purposes for us. Not only does it provide an opportunity for public engagement and people to kind of get a more personal experience with bats and maybe not fear them so much if they can see them, but it also gives us a chance to kind of track the timing of certain life history events. So when did the bats leave? When did they arrive? When is the first pup born? These are all things that are probably contingent or tied or changing possibly with climate. So if we get good data and a really robust way of documenting that over time, we might be in a better position to respond to it, right? And it can also allow us to track the actual numbers of bats in this colony over time. And the more counts that we can get, the closer we get to that true number. You kind of limit a lot of the noise that happens during surveys. And we're going to get a really robust opportunity to study intensively this colony. And then also see all their cool little unique behaviors that we never get to see because generally we don't get to see bats very often. So for your viewing pleasure, if the video works, this was taken last year. This is as a clip, and I won't play the whole thing, but it is fun. You can see how much they're grooming each other and grooming themselves. I mean, bats are so clean. They're spending most of their time grooming, sleeping. These are big brown bats. I mentioned their beautiful glossy fur. That's my favorite part. The bat comes in. But you can just see how like very social they are. They're communicating with each other. They're grooming each other. They're beautiful. So enjoy. I hope everybody gets as much pleasure out of this. I geek out on this way more than I'm a bit ashamed to admit how much I watch this camera, but it's very fun. So I'll give you the website in just a moment. But the other part of it that I did mention is the emergence counts. And this is something that everybody can engage in. There's a data sheet available on the White Memorial website and the Connecticut Deep website, where you can find the streaming experience. There's also a data sheet that you can enter if you want to participate in a count. So you can help us count the bats. It's really easy. Sorry, I should have been playing this the whole time. This is like, so you can see them just coming out, and this is really an easy place to count bats. Sometimes you don't get them coming out of just one hole. And in like succession like that, and there's bats coming out of multiple places, and it can be really hard. These bats come out of one hole, they go right past the camera, and they're very easy to count, and it can be a really joyful experience and just kind of fun and something quirky that you can do, is count bats remotely from the comfort of your own home where you're not being bit by mosquitoes. So that is our bat count website. Another thing you can do is if you have bats if you have your own maternity colony, we would love to get those counts. I can't possibly get out and count every maternity colony that's on the landscape in Connecticut, but I would love every count that I can get. So if you do have a colony in a bat house or in a barn or even in your attic, and you're willing, once or twice a year, or even maybe once a month during the summer, to count those bats, I'm in the process of migrating it to a completely online platform. But for now, there is a form on our website that you can fill out and give us, what time you started the count, how many bats you saw, what time did the first bat come out, et cetera. And then that gives us a way to monitor bats with the public's help over time. Another really cool thing that somebody did, and he sent me this video. This is just somebody that like put a camera, like a basic trail cam, underneath a bat house that he had mounted. And he's passively collecting data on these bats. So he just left this open, and he can watch the bats coming in and out. And then if we give it just a moment, I'll try and fast forward it. He even gets to see them at night. So you can kind of see that there's some bats in there and watch their behavior. So, you can do the bat cam that we did, but you can do it at home if you have a bat house that's colonized. It's a really cool opportunity. So I just like to share that with people. Okay. There's also a bat sightings reporting framework that we have. Again, this is also being migrated to an online platform that I think will be a little more user-friendly. But for now, we do have a form online. If you see a bat flying out during the day, or if you just have, you saw some bats and you want to share that with us, we do actually use those data, and we do put them in a database, and it does kind of help us monitor public engagement, as well as like maybe some biological things that we might be interested in. So you can see that these sightings really pulsed quite a bit right after white nose came. And I think that's part of that is because there were a lot more bats in these like unexpected times and places that people were seeing. But also there was just a lot more public engagement and awareness because it was a new thing. And then that did kind of taper off, but we still get, 60 people that take time out of their day to report a bat sighting to us each year. So it's very valuable information. We do appreciate it. Killing the lights. So we just sponsored a study that was done out at Great Hollow Nature Preserve in East, sorry, I'm so dyslexic in Connecticut. I always say West when I mean East. Western Connecticut, Great Hollow Nature Preserve, the research director out there did this experiment that we helped fund, where they took a wetland where bats forage, and they put up acoustic detectors basically at 0.0, which is where the lights that they put up were. And then at 25, 50, and 75 meters from that light source. And then they just alternated randomly what nights the lights were on and what nights the lights were off. And on the nights that the lights were on, no little brown bats, zero, absolutely not a single little brown bat could be heard or detected. And this effect of limiting the number of bats for little browns and big browns to some degree also had an effect up to at least 75 meters. So for every person that has a light out on their porch in the landscape, that's at least 75 meters of spherical space around that light that's not available to these bats to forage. So as much as we can turn off our lights at night, obviously don't compromise your safety or your level of comfort. But if you can turn off the light and it doesn't bother you to do so, then I do encourage you to do that. Bat Day is every September. This year, I think it's on September 15th. This is at Old Newgate Prison in East Granby, which is the site of an active hibernacula that the bats use in the mine that's there. It's also really a cool cultural and historical experience to go there. I think it's the first prison in all of the United States, which is kind of cool. It's a very cool experience, and oftentimes we do have Maureen Heitman joins us. I think Jerry comes often, and one or the other of them do bring an educational animal that people can look at. You can also take a tour of the mine where the bats do hibernate. They're not going to be there when you're visiting because they don't come until later, and we close down the mine when the bats are using it. But you can see where the bats are hibernating. It's pretty cool. So we encourage people to come to that. It's lots of fun. Here's my contact information if you need to get a hold of me, devaughn.fraser@ct.gov. We also have the deep.bat program at ct.gov that you can email. And then if you want to go to our bats count webpage, I always just Google bats count batcam, and it'll bring you to either the deep page or the white memorial page. You can access it from both of those. But if you want to take a screenshot or look at the recording of this later, those are the actual addresses if you want to type in the URLs. And quick shout out to some Western species that we don't have here, but just because I'm from California, our Western species are also lovely. The pallid bat down in the lower left-hand corner is my absolute favorite species on the planet. Big brown bats are a close second, but lots of bat diversity, and they're all just so, they have different personalities, different species have different personalities, and they're all just lovely. So with that, I thank you so much, and I'm sorry I went over, and I will take any questions or comments that people have.
Wow, this was fantastic, Devaughn. I mean, so much great information. And just so everyone knows, when I send the recording out, I'll print up all those links, and I'll put them in text in with the video so everyone can access them. We actually do have a California member, but she requested the recording afterwards. She couldn't come tonight, so I'm going to tell her what she missed from California. I have to say, I wasn't aware that white nose had hit California yet, so that's unfortunately really sobering. I can see from your map how much in the last 3 or 4 years it really hit the Midwest and West full force there. So
it's spreading. I should clarify that in California, luckily we haven't seen signs of the actual disease yet, but we have just detected the fungus. So I'm sorry I didn't make that clear. But again, the fungus is there, which means the disease is probably
exactly
not too long to follow. So yeah, thank you. I was a little heartbroken when that first detection came out. So
I felt the same way following the avian flu map before it encompassed the entire U.S. Just watching it knock off state after state.
Oh, I know.
So I'm going to open it up to questions. You can write in the chat. You can unmute yourself. I've been keeping a list. I have a whole list of questions I've had that I've kept during this. So maybe I will start off. And I don't know if you want to stop screen sharing. So
I can do that.
Anybody wants to come on screen. You mentioned. I know that there's some federally listed bats. Oh, by the way, I tell people, if you want to know the picture behind me, I was with Chris in Australia, and we actually went to a major bat rehabilitation facility, and this is one of the there we go, one of the beautiful fruit bats that was there. We just fell in love with the place. We got to meet quite a few lovely bats there. So I did take this photo that's behind me. But anyway, you were saying we have some federally listed bats. Does Connecticut list any additional bats as endangered for the state itself?
Yeah, great question. Actually, we have more protections. All of our bats are listed in some way. So, well, the big brown bat is a species of greatest conservation need, but it's not like state endangered or state threatened. But basically, all of the other white nose affected species are state endangered. So we have higher protections for the other species in the state and that's true for most states in the Northeast where white nose is hit. There's more state protections for across the board. And then our tree bats are species of special concern. So they're not threatened or endangered at the state level, but we do keep an eye on them.
And I want to, speaking of tree bats, so for our cave bats, I know I hear this question a lot. So our cave bats and it may not even be the right term, but they migrate locally. So they're one place for their maternity colonies. And I guess I don't know where the males are, they're flying around somewhere. But then they move into hibernaculums or caves for the winter. So it's more of a local migration.
Yeah.
But our tree bats are true migrators, I guess. So where did they go?
Yeah, that is
Or
the
do
question of all questions. No, so we kind of have a pulse on where they're going based on like where they're kind of showing up more frequently at certain times of the year. And so a lot of that information is just like iNaturalist is a really good resource. Like people will be like, oh, look, I have a silver-haired bat. It's actually one of the ways that we knew silver-haired bats are hanging around in the winter because we've had this really increase in sightings on iNaturalist and other kinds of citizen science pages for that. But so that's a great question. We don't have a lot of data because bats are so small and the radios that we put on them, we glue on them, and that glue falls off after about 2 or 3 weeks. And the batteries only last about 2 to 3 weeks. So getting that full scale of their migrate, it's not like birds where you can put on a GPS or a solar powered thing because bats are out at night. So the solar doesn't do much good there.
right.
But there's been some work out in California on hoary bats, and I mean, those babies move. We're talking 400 or 500 kilometers in a day or two.
Wow.
Yeah, they're
Are, are
really moving.
are bats going to warmer climates for the winter?
I mean,
Like,
that's the general idea that we think. Yeah, they kind of move south. They're certainly not going north. But the difference that we're seeing now is that they're just not. They're not making the commute because there might be it's not getting as cold for as long. Um, that we're finding them in like rock crevices over the silver-haired bats have been showing up in rock crevices where we don't know if we just didn't look there before or if they're just all of a sudden using them, but increasingly we're finding them present in the winter. So I think it's tied to climate. But again, we just unfortunately we just don't have very good means of studying these very cryptic animals.
yeah, it was like in the past, like for example, with hummingbirds, we very rarely saw a species that wasn't a ruby-throated
Mhm.
in Connecticut. Now every year we have dozens of reports of all kinds of hummingbirds that
Yeah,
are here for the winter. And this, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that was unheard of.
yeah.
And we think that's certainly due to the climate changes. So let me go to chat. I have more questions, but let me go to chat for some questions. So Kim and Iris asked, does the fungus affect any other mammals or birds?
Not that we know of. Nope. Yeah, not that we know of, because there's really not any other animals that are hibernating in these and mammals that are hibernating in these cave environments. So as far as we can tell, it's just bats. That might change, but to the best of our knowledge, no, bats are the main species that are affected.
Okay. Ruth Ann asks, avian flu is cross species. Yes, I mean, that's going to be a large problem. Is that a concern for bats?
Um, I mean, just like everything, sure, any new emerging potentially zoonotic virus is alarming. In fact, we have completely, as a community of bat biologists, changed the way we handle bats. We always wear masks. We always wear gloves. We don't handle bats without masks anymore because we don't know if they can get COVID. There's a lot of research that suggests that maybe our North American species aren't susceptible to COVID, but we can't afford to get it wrong, so we're exercising extreme precaution in that. I don't know about avian flu, whether bats would be susceptible to that, but if it's zoonotic and the virus figures out how to leap across. The other thing about zoonotic viruses is that we have to remember that pretty
Oh,
much
you,
every stressed, our immune systems aren't as robust.
right, right.
Did I? Yeah. So
Yeah,
that's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I hope not.
I don't think any of us know the answer, but avian flu is now a
Yeah,
hopping species. So,
I
who
know it's
knows?
scary.
Nancy wants to know how long
Yeah,
bats
who knows?
mentioned 40 years, I think earlier.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly in the wild, that's going to vary. Most bats probably live 10 to 12 years in the wild, but for this, there's at least one bat that was caught after 33 years after being banded, and then another bat more recently, I think in Europe, was 40 40 plus years, maybe 41 or 42 years. So they're capable of living a really long time.
Makes you wonder if their hair starts to turn gray if they're that old.
You know, I've seen bats with like what I call alopecia, and I don't know if it's an age-related thing. I mean, you would think, sure, animals senesce, and when they do, things like hair starts to limit.
Yeah,
I've never seen a completely bald bat, but I have seen bats with little bald patches on their back. And I don't know. I never thought it was age-related. I always thought it was stress-related, but it's a good question. I don't know.
you don't know.
I feel like that's the answer to all my questions. I'm like, do you know anything, Devaughn? Sorry.
Yeah. So you mentioned about the lights, and lights out. Of course, there's been a huge push in Connecticut for that and other locations. And again, you hear it mostly with relations to birds and fireflies. So it was very interesting to hear that there's also an adverse relationship between night lights and bats as well, unfortunately.
Yeah.
What about now with birds? They say you can use other lights like red lights that still allow us as humans to have security and to see, but it doesn't adversely affect the birds. I'm wondering if there are different wavelengths or colors of lights that would be less likely to negatively impact the bats if we use them at night.
That's a really great question. So we just used LED lights in our study, but that's kind of the next step is to start disentangling and performing the same study with different types of light. So that's on the docket for us to look into a little further. But that work hasn't been done. A lot of the lighting stuff that's been done with bats and wildlife in general has been done in Europe. They kind of do a better job of bat conservation in general there, to be honest. But um, yeah, we haven't gotten that answer yet. But it's a great question, and yeah, it might be possible that different wavelengths don't affect them quite the same way.
It would be nice if the same wavelengths that don't adversely affect birds are the same ones that don't adversely affect bats.
Yeah,
That would be very convenient if that were the case.
it would be. And that's a great starting point for that type of study is we'll start with the ones that show the most promise, the greatest
Yeah.
benefit of everybody. So that's a
Yeah,
great
unfortunately,
suggestion.
anecdote, like I have a motion detector over the garage. It's a
I do too.
very low level, but it's an old um the halogen, those long tubes that break if you touch them.
Yep.
I have that. I don't have them on LED. The light is very, very soft and only comes on brighter if something sets it off. A lot of the people around have LED lights because that's kind of what they sell these days. But I find those so much harsher and brighter, and I'm hoping that my very low level dim light isn't an issue. And I don't, even though it's broken, I've had to repair it several times. I don't want to replace it because I know nowadays what's available is so much more glaring and bright.
Yeah, like I said, I don't think that we should ever compromise our own safety as humans for the bat. I mean, at an individual level, that's an individual choice. But yeah, generally don't if the light is keeping you safe or at least giving you the feeling of safety and protection, then don't do that. And we were doing this in a wetland where bats are actively foraging. There's a good chance that bats wouldn't actively be foraging right around your house anyway. But if you have a big yard and a big property or maybe a pond then maybe bats are using your yard, but not if you have a light on all the time. So
Actually, they are foraging because I go out at night in the summer and the fall. They're flying around catching insects all the time. So
yeah. Okay. So yeah, I'm
it,
sure. I mean, I don't know. It's a great question. I think that's the next step that we want to look into is what types of lights are better or worse. So great point.
now Ruth Ann says, I saw huge and noisy bats leaving park trees at dusk in Australia, I think in Sydney. Yeah, I saw in Australia, you've got mostly these large fruit bats.
Yeah, they're
And
like 4 feet wingspans.
oh, it's amazing.
They're amazing.
You go to Sydney or you go up to Cairns or a lot of places just on like regular streets. You're walking down the street and there are these huge colonies. I saw the same thing in Cambodia too. Just these huge colonies of fruit bats, and they're just a marvel because they do look like, if you can see this picture. I mean, they really are this cute. They're like basically puppies with wings on them, and they're very delightful, and they won't
are.
harm you in any way. And unfortunately, especially in Australia, with climate change, they have a very narrow range of temperature compatibility. And as Australia gets even hotter and hotter than it is, they have these massive die-offs whenever they have a heat wave there, and you have thousands of these dead bats because it gets up to 105, 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and they can't even take the heat, and they're just not adjusting to these changes. Plus, there's a ton of barbed wire in Australia, used to keep in, cattle and sheep and stuff. And they just don't, just like we have a problem with glass here, with birds flying into glass windows, they have a problem with bats. They just don't register the barbed wire, and they fly across and they catch their wings on it, and they often die hanging there. If someone finds them, they can be rescued. And this bat center that we went to has a lot of bats that were rescued from tears. But if they tear their wings and they can't be repaired, they can no longer be released to the wild. So there's a movement there to try to get farmers to take down the barbed wire or switch to wire that's not barbed, because it's just slaughtering so many of the bats there. And of course, you have the farmers who hate the bats because they descend on the orchards and eat all the fruit. Though, as we learned, they're not actually eating fruit. It's interesting. They take the fruit and they squeeze all the juice out and they drop the pulp, and then other animals get to eat the pulp, but they're really drinking their fruit. They're not actually eating the fruit itself. But I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, but so
no, that's if you ever have a chance, Amy and I will both give a plug for visiting Australia or somewhere where there are all these flying foxes. They look like foxes, so we call them flying foxes. They do. They just have puppy dog faces, and they're just so cute. And it's just so mystical. I remember I was in Australia too, in Gold Coast, and I was there with my sister who's like in the movie industry, and we were going out to nice dinners all the time. And you're sitting out in this like promenade area in like downtown Gold Coast, and there's like restaurants everywhere and people out dining, and all of a sudden a bat with a 4-foot wingspan just like silently glides overhead. I'm sitting there like smiling ear to ear, and I won't shut up about the bats. At the end of that trip, people were like, Devaughn, shut up about the bats. We don't care. I'm like, what? But
it's hard.
they're amazing.
Bats and cockatoos, what can,
Yeah.
And Dorian says, I thought that exterior lights would attract insects, which would then attract bats. Interesting to hear that's not true.
So that's a good point. So I did say some species are limited. So eastern red bats do forage around lights, and they do seem to like to be attracted to the insects that are disoriented. So, I mean, poor insects, like they get disoriented. They think they're flying towards the moon, and then they realize they're not, and they drop, and then they're like, oh wait, the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon. Nope, not the moon. Oh, the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon. Like so confused. So some bats do take advantage of that. But right now, because we're concerned about the ones that are white nose affected and less common, that those ones do seem to be affected by light. So that's a very good point. I can't remember who said that, but great observation.
Yeah. And then Ruth Ann says, perhaps having lights on our properties that point down might be helpful for bats and lightning bugs as opposed to floodlights. And of course, only use motion lights.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you don't have to necessarily just completely limit lights or remove lights from your property, but those are all great points. Like anything that we do that's like one small little step, it's like all of us recycling, right? If one person recycles and the rest of the world doesn't, it really doesn't make that much of a difference. But if a bunch of people start doing little things, then it can make a difference. So yeah, I would say downward facing lights, certainly floodlights that are like lighting up the sky are probably the worst for the bats.
Exactly. I wanted to ask you with the bat monitoring. So probably maybe 2-3 years ago, I got an email from Deep about doing the bat monitoring, and I was very, very excited and immediately tried to sign up. But the routes, at least within driving distance of me, I'm down on the coast, were all taken. And I was just wondering if there are still any opportunities. I mean, we have people on this chat who are from all over Connecticut and outside Connecticut. Do you know if there are still any more openings? I mean, that's something I would just love to do, drive around and record the bats.
Yeah.
If there's more opportunities for people to do that.
So that's a really good question. I'm getting a little overwhelmed by the acoustic monitoring, the mobile transects, because it's one of the problems I'm having is that the software that we use for the navigation and the GPS part is so outdated that there's no way to put it onto new computers, and some of our computers are tanking. Like these are old, donated laptops that are kind of have reached the end of their lifespan. So I'm trying to figure out how I can get the softwares that we've used to be consistent and onto new computers. So there is one. Whereabouts are you located? Where on the coast?
I'm in Guilford.
Oh,
So,
Guilford. I'm going to be down there on Friday.
oh,
You're where the least shrews are. We have least shrews down there. Another
oh,
endangered mammal species in the state. Um, so Guilford is kind of
where,
close to Cockaponset Forest, right? Not too far.
all the Middlesex County routes.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so it's possible, actually, the Nahantic, you might be a little far from Nahantic, maybe. That one, the person who's been driving that, she does it every year. Last year, she just had a lot of problems, and I kind of get the feeling like she's maybe over it at this point. But I don't know. But that's great to know, and let me keep you in mind. And kind of, I haven't reached out to any of the volunteers. We might have somebody drop out, and then I could definitely, and even if not, you're welcome to join. I have a route that I do all the way out in Patchogue Forest, so I'd be happy to take you on at least one um, survey if you'd ever like to join for that. Or I can partner you with somebody else that is in your area, maybe a little closer or something. Let me work on that for you.
And if you have any other routes, just drop me an email because I can
Okay.
send it out to the club because we have some people from all over the state. So I don't know if you have any other openings.
I do. My new Fairfield route has kind of had different people on it the last couple years, and I don't think the person who did it last year. So that route is really fun. It's one of our really bat sexy sites and routes. You get a lot of myotis on that one. But it's a little far from you certainly. But if anybody's in the new Fairfield area, Kent, it goes from Kent to New Fairfield.
We do have people. In fact, we have people on this Zoom that are from that area.
Okay, it's beautiful up there. So if anybody, I mean, Connecticut's beautiful across the board, but yeah, certainly you all have my email. So if you have interest in that, then send me an email and I will organize the volunteer coordination soon. And
Wonderful.
we can work on that. Thank you.
I already do the bird monitoring for DEP. I do that. I do have a route. So
Oh, cool. Okay. What are those like point counts?
it's one where you go around it at night and you counting.
Oh, is this
Your
on the shorebirds or whippoorwills?
this is the night the whippoorwill. Yeah.
Whippoorwills. Oh, cool. So you must work with men.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Ruth Ann says, do you have any counterparts in Massachusetts and New Hampshire? And I know we had some Rhode Island people too. So if you know of any other people doing bat monitoring in New England, if you have any links you want to share for that, I can pass it on to people as well.
Okay, let me think about that. I don't know what other states are doing in terms of their like volunteer efforts. I do know that, I mean, every state has a me or some version of me. And yeah, there's a lot of bat research going on in all the New England states. So I can certainly link people with resources as
Fabulous.
needed.
Okay, does anybody have any other questions? You can put them in the chat or unmute. If anything pops up. And again, Devaughn, I want to thank you so much for sharing this with us. It was a wonderful talk, really educational. I know everybody enjoyed it. I had a number of people who couldn't make it tonight who are going to be looking for the recording as well. So we really appreciate your taking time out of your evening to do this for us. It's really great information. So a number of people put comments in the chat you can look at. Thanking you for the presentation. But if nobody else has any comments, I'm going to turn off the recording now.